Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Rashida Kilpatrick. I am the Policy Director for National Action Network Los Angeles. Thank you so much for being here. As you all know, this year is a very important year. We're trying to encourage everyone to get out and vote, not just for the president, however. Also, we have some very important ballot measures on our ballot this year, and we want to make sure that everyone knows what's on the ballot measures, know what the ballot measures are, know how they're going to affect our community so that they can be empowered to vote. When picking people to be on the forum tonight, you'll see that we have a lot of people who are actually in the community organizers, attorneys, actual professors, people who know how these proposition measures will actually affect us. And so they're going to let us know what we think, and we'll be able to ask them questions. And so we're really excited. So let's get this show on the road. Before we actually get started, I would like to introduce to you our president, Reverend Jonathan Mosley. He's been very instrumental in making sure that we are out in the community. And so he's always been very supportive. And he's been very excited about this proposition forum as well. So let's throw it to President Jonathan Mosley.
Good evening and welcome to this very important forum. It's going to be a lot of great information given out that you're going to need. Most of all, at the end, get out and vote. You can also visit our website, nationalactionnetworkla.com. Register and get into the action.
Thank you. As you guys can hear, it is very, very important that you guys get out and vote again. I think you're going to hear that all night tonight, and I don't mind saying it. I'll probably say it 20 times. Our panelists will probably say it 10 more exactly. So please make sure you all get out to vote. And in helping us do that tonight and helping us spread the information, we have British Waja. She is from League of Women Voters. I've worked with her in the past at other organizations, so I was really excited to reach out to her and to have her come and help us today. So British, thank you so much for being on here.
Thank you for having me, Rashida and National Action Network. And I'm really excited to share some basic information about the propositions with you this evening. And so just as Rashida mentioned, I'm with the League of Women Voters. And what I'm going to do now is get ready to share the screen so we can get this presentation going.
Yeah, no, definitely. I've already saw some of your presentation, and you're really good at making sure that you break it down in bite-sized bits for us because it's a lot of information. So thank you so much for doing that. And just to remind everyone, as British is talking, we want you to go ahead and throw your questions in the comment box so that you can ask questions. It's going to take a little while for it to upload. So as soon as you get a question, please ask it, and so we can get that answered. All right, thanks, British.
Thank you. Good evening again, everyone. My name is British Waja, and I'm with League of Women Voters. And tonight we'll be going over some of the propositions that are on the upcoming ballot for the November 3rd election. And before we get started with the ballots, I do want to give you just a little bit of information about the League of Women Voters and what we do in general. The League does not support or oppose any candidates or political parties. Our main platform is about voter education, voter awareness, and also encouraging people to be involved within the government and influence public policy through the act of voting, right? So just keep that in mind. Everybody has an opportunity to have a voice as it relates to government and politics, and that's through your vote. And so this evening's presentation is going to go through the various propositions that are on the upcoming ballot. I will provide you with just a general background of the proposition, what will change as a result of the proposition if it goes into place, what a yes vote means, what a no vote means, and we'll also discuss some arguments for and against each of the propositions. My presentation also includes some information about the money behind who is in favor or against the measure. I may not go into detail about that, but you'll be able to see it briefly as we flip through the various slides. And again, as Rashida mentioned, if you do have questions, please feel free to ask those in the chat box, the comment box, whatever platform you're using, and I'm sure they will work on getting your questions answered. And so when we're talking about propositions, what we're voting for, propositions can be a few different things, right? So it could be a bond measure, a constitutional amendment, and I want to highlight the last two, which are initiatives and referendums, primarily because the majority of the propositions on the ballot this year are initiatives. There is one referendum, and that's Prop 25 in relation to cash bail. So just keep in mind, as it relates to a referendum, that's really asking you to state your position on a law that was already passed. With initiatives, when you go through the proposition, it's important to identify what happens once this proposition goes into place. Can it be changed through legislature, or can it be changed through, does it have to be changed through voting? And so with most initiatives, there has to be explicit language that says legislature has the right to change it. If that language is not included in the proposition, the legislature is not allowed to change the law once it goes into place. And so with propositions, if they want to be amended, they have to be amended with another initiative. And so now I'm just going to go through which propositions are on the ballot. There are 12 propositions. We're not going to cover all of those this evening. We're going to go through 7 of those propositions. And it sounds like we have the opportunity for some lively conversation with regards to positions on the various propositions at the end. That's not what I will be doing for the presentation. Again, it'll just be fact-based and giving you the basics on each proposition. The other thing to keep in mind is that in addition to the 12 propositions, there's also 2 measures, Measure J, which we will discuss this evening, as well as Measure RR for LAUSD. So now I'm going to get started with Prop 15. And this proposition is asking you if the California Constitution should be amended so most commercial and industrial property is reassessed on a regular basis. This proposition was put on the ballot by petition signers. And just to give you a little bit of background of where we are today, commercial and industrial property is taxed based on the property value at original purchase price, and is adjusted for inflation annually up to 2%. So it's taxed just like residential. In addition to that, businesses themselves do pay property taxes on business equipment. And when we're talking about business equipment, that is machinery, computers, furniture, things of that nature. And so I want to point those 2 out because those are 2 areas that would be impacted if Prop 15 were to go into place. And so let's just kind of talk about the purpose and intent of this proposition. The first thing is what it would change for commercial property. First, commercial property would be taxed based on the current value as opposed to the original purchase price adjusted for inflation. Now, not all commercial property would be subject to this reassessment. It would be for commercial property that is valued over $3 million. So any commercial property that is valued at $3 million or less would be excluded. The one caveat to keep in mind is that it's also based on the ownership. So if one owner has 3 million or less in commercial property, that owner is excluded. But if they have over 3 million in commercial property, their property would be reassessed. And that 3 million is also going to be adjusted for inflation every 2 years. In terms of the reassessment of the property value, that would be completed every 3 years. It would be brought to the current market value. Something I want to point out on here is what is commercial property for the purpose of this proposition. And I know that there's been some conversation that it does include apartment buildings. And just to be very clear with how the text defines commercial property, so it's defined as commercial and industrial only. It does not apply to residential or agricultural land. On the next slide, I'll define residential so that it's clear that it does not include apartment buildings. And so going back to the business tangible property, personal property tax. So every business that owns property is subject to paying taxes on that business property. And we're not talking about a physical building, right? And what the proposition would change is for small businesses, and there's a specific definition for small businesses, those businesses would be excluded from paying any property tax on business equipment. For all other businesses, there would be an exclusion of up to 500, the first 500,000. And so that would be excluded to kind of help adjust for any increases that could potentially occur. And when we talked about how initiatives work, that $500,000 amount, it cannot be reduced, but the legislature can increase it and say, okay, we want to exclude a larger amount. So that is an option. And lastly, these changes would take effect over time beginning in 2022. And so I'll talk a little bit more about this over time on the next slide. The first thing I want to highlight is how residential property is defined for the purpose of this proposition. Residential property includes both single family and multi-unit structures and the land on which those structures are constructed. And so if it is an apartment building, it will not be subject to reassessment under Prop 15. Another thing to keep in mind is if it is a mixed use property, so maybe it's a storefront on the bottom and it's apartment buildings on the top, the portion that's subject to reassessment is limited to the square footage that's used for commercial purposes. In addition, the proposition does have text that will allow the legislature to exclude reassessment completely if at least 75% of the square footage is attributed to residential. So the text is not clear on if that has to happen, but it does say that the legislature may decide to do that. And so when we talk about property taxes and what that changes and what the impact of that is, it would provide for increased and stable revenues for schools, cities, counties, and local agencies. This proposition, the purpose of it is to provide additional funding that's consistent with the local control funding. So once the additional property tax funds are obtained, as opposed to them going into the general fund for the state, they will go into a separate fund that is monitored, and it requires the counties and the local jurisdictions to be transparent in how the money was used annually. The last thing I want to point out is the deferment of the assessments. And so although this will go into effect in 2022, there is the option to defer the impact until 2025 if at least 50% of the commercial building is occupied by small businesses. And for the purpose of this proposition, small businesses include businesses with 50 full-time equivalent employees, 50 or less, fewer than 50. And also if they own real property, so business equipment in California, and they're also independently owned. And so if they do account for at least 50% of the occupied space, then it would not take effect until the 2025-26 lean year. And so when we talk about the fiscal impact of this, overall, it's expected to generate an additional $6.5 to $11.5 billion per year in property tax revenues beginning in 2025 when it takes in full effect. This will provide new funding for local governments and schools. And similar to how the money is allocated today, 60% will go to local government services. So that would be cities, counties, as well as like fire departments, things of that nature. And then the other 40% will be allocated for schools and community colleges. And the money would be given to the counties by the state for costs carrying out the measure. So the proposition identifies like if this goes into effect initially, the counties would not have the resources to account for a reassessment costs, things of that nature. And so that money would be provided to the counties through the general fund. Once the funds have been generated in 2025, that money would have to be repaid. And so just to go over a few arguments that are in favor and against this measure, those in favor say that this closes corporate loopholes. And a lot of that is attributed to the fact that When businesses sell, in certain instances, they sell all the assets of the business, but if they have property, if they have real property, it's not reassessed at current market value. And so that's one aspect of the loophole. And the other aspect is that in most instances, you don't see residential accounting for the significant portion of property tax as you do here in California. Other arguments in favor point out that it does not impact homeowners and renters, and it protects agricultural land, and that it cuts small businesses. Some arguments against this say that it will raise the cost of living and it could destroy jobs and small businesses. It lacks accountability, and it will repeal some of the taxpayer protection on Prop 13. And so, as I communicated earlier, if you want to follow the money, this kind of gives you an idea of the top 3 contributors that are in favor and against, and the total amount of money that's been raised for the proposition through June of this year. And so that is Prop 15. Just keep in mind, a yes vote means that the property taxes on most commercial properties worth over $3 million would be increased to provide new funding for local governments and schools. A no vote means that the property taxes would stay the same and there would be no new funding provided. And I will turn it back over to you, Rashida.
And now I wanted to talk with me and Tim, because we have Tim on, and he is a community organizer who has been working really closely with the Yes on 15. And I invited him to come because, like Tim, I've seen so many commercials for and against Prop 15. Both of them claim to say that they're the right thing. Both of them claim to help small businesses and help schools and whatnot. Can you give me your take on it and how it would affect the community?
Well, first thing that I would like to do is to thank British for that extensive explanation of what Prop 15 is. Before I say anything, I really appreciate that. It's thorough, but it's technical. And a lot of our folks need to hear like the simple explanation of. And before I begin, I'd like to ask the question: if 3 rich and powerful white men get into an argument, should we come up with the bruises?
I don't think so.
Exactly. And that is the birth of Proposition 13. And 13 is the reason for this. In 1978, our wonderful Governor Jerry Brown and tax protesters Howard Jarvis and Paul Gantz got into an argument over a California budget surplus. They had the Gantz team had been trying to pass tax initiatives up until that point, and they found us in a fear-based recession where everybody was scared about raising taxes, and they utilized that to leverage a vote for this proposition. But at the end of it, what it was really about is them arguing over money. And that argument resulted in over 41 years there being over $560 billion worth of tax revenue extracted from the California economy.
Wow.
This puts money back in the economy when it is passed, but we must not forget the money that's been extracted out of our economy over 41 years. And that is an unfairness that is of unbelievable proportions.
Okay. Well, I have a couple, one of the things that they always say is that this tax hike or whatever will be passed down to small businesses and whatnot. What do you say to that?
That is an untruth. That is an untruth that's shared by like the opposition, because folks who aren't paying taxes, they don't want to see this because it invites corporations through the vote to pay their fair share of taxes. And at this point, the property owners foot the tax bill in California. Over 75% of the tax bill is paid by property owners. And we want to flip that and let corporations who can afford it, who are taking advantage of this loophole that was baked into a back door of a proposition that seemed to have promise for most of us, but really only benefited the extremely wealthy property owners.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I thought that was a little weird, right? Because everyone is saying that it's going to come down to small business paying this, but my understanding is only the top like 10% of earners are actually going to be affected by this.
Yes, there's a small percentage, 10% or less of major corporations who will be paying this tax bill. And it's only fair when you look at the damages that have been done by corporations not paying their fair share of tax, and a moment in time when our state would rather invest in the increase in prison populations and not schools, then of course, but we don't want that. We don't want our schools filled with 600 kids that only have one nurse 2 times a week or
Right.
one counselor. It's just unfair.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for being on and talking about that and giving us the real world effect of what Proposition 15 and how it would affect our community. Thanks so much. We're actually going to now go back to British for Proposition 16, which is yet another proposition that has been very confusing on both sides. It's about diversity on both sides. It's supposedly about equality, but that can't possibly be. Can it, British? Is that, are both sides right? Well, I guess you can't tell me that. We'll go to the panelists afterwards, but both sides say that it's about equality, right? You're on mute.
Excuse me. Both sides do say that it is. It's very clear cut what this proposition will do. And so this is basically a proposition on affirmative action. And what this proposition is asking you is, should the ban on affirmative action be removed? Okay, that's pretty much it. It will repeal Prop 209, which put a ban on affirmative action. And so currently the California federal constitutions require equal protection for all people. And as I communicated, in 1996, voters approved Prop 209, and it basically banned the consideration of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in California public employment, public education, and contracting. So it banned affirmative action. However, it does allow those entities to do so when it's required to receive federal funding. And so since Prop 209 has been in place, what you find is these entities are having to find more creative ways to encourage diversity in their establishments. So maybe universities are saying, we're going to take someone if they're the first college graduate, or based on your neighborhood, or based on what high school you use. So the proposal for Proposition 16 is to repeal the ban on affirmative action, which would allow the California state and local governments to consider diversity as a factor. And any new policies have to be consistent with federal and state laws related to equal protection. And again, this would apply for public colleges, universities, and public agencies. And it would also apply to how they provide contracting decisions as well. So this doesn't have any fiscal impact. And when we talk about arguments in favor or against, in favor, basically, we're saying this truly means equal opportunities for all Californians, and people are still experiencing discrimination. Those against it basically communicate that this would allow favoritism as it relates to diversity. And it's also perpetuating a stereotype that people cannot succeed without support or special preferences. And so here are some of the top contributors for and against. You can see the money that was raised there. And just to recap, Prop 16, a yes vote means that state and local entities can consider race, sex, color, ethnicity. Again, Prop 16, if you vote yes, you're saying, I want to eliminate the ban on affirmative action. If you vote no, you want the ban on affirmative action to remain in place. Rashida, I'll turn it back over to you.
That was good. That was really good. So, while both are talking about diversity and racial inclusion, they both have different ideas about how that actually works. And this person that we picked is dear to my heart. She very much knows how this works. It is my friend and colleague, Erica Wilson. She is at University of North Carolina. She went to law school with me at UCLA Law School, and we both went to law school at UCLA right after Prop 209 was passed. And so we felt the effects firsthand on how the absence of affirmative action actually affected not only just diversity in general, but the students, the professors, and we actually wrote a brief to the Supreme Court based on our experiences. And so I definitely wanted to have her on so that she can help to tell everyone how this actually does affect the community. Erica Wilson, thanks for being on.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here and to talk about this issue. It is near and dear to my heart. As you said, we were directly affected by Proposition 209 going to UCLA right after its implementation. I want to start by saying this. I mean, one of the narratives around this proposition is the big bad boogeyman of affirmative action. And I think especially for Black people, other Latinx people, we automatically get on the defensive when we hear affirmative action because there are stereotypes about it, meaning that we are unqualified, and even the language around it, they call it a preference. So the first thing we have to understand when we're looking at Proposition 16 is how we talk about this and what different terms mean. So for starters, in California, nationally, the state country was built on systemic racism that favored whites in many ways in terms of hiring, job, college admissions, etc. And so affirmative action, actually the first affirmative action program started in 1964. And the idea was after all that systemic racism and subordinating and holding back Black people especially, you can't just say we're going to stop now and give them they'll have this same opportunity. That's not realistic. The idea was that we actually have to take affirmative measures to make sure they actually have equal opportunity. That lasted for all of 13 years. The first legal challenge to affirmative action came in 1978, not very much longer after that. And so Prop 209 in California was an outgrowth of the backlash to the idea that we should have to do something positive or affirmative to remedy our history of very terrible past discrimination. So when we think about it that way, affirmative action is actually a pretty conservative correction to a systemically racist system that consistently advantages whites and disadvantages others. So I'll just give one more concrete example using college admissions. So let's say a school like UCLA decides it's going to give preferences to people who are legacy admits. And by legacy admits, it means your family went there, graduated there. Well, the problem is because of the history of past discrimination, most legacies are going to be white because Black and Latinx people were excluded in many ways. They won't benefit from that. And so affirmative action, Prop 16, what it would do is to essentially acknowledge to treat everyone equally is not to treat everyone the same. It's about equity, acknowledging the systemic racism that ensures that whites have built-in advantages and evens the playing field.
Okay. Well, I wanted to open this up to questions. We're going to bring Lori and British back on to see if we have questions from the audience. But while we're bringing them back on, I have a question. What do you say to people who say, this proposition would kind of bring down the quality of schools and the quality of jobs? Like it just opens the door for a whole bunch of people to come in who aren't qualified?
Well, the first thing I would say to that is that the standards that we use, for example, to determine college admissions, they're not race neutral to begin with. They are baked in to give preferences to non-people of color. Take standardized test scores. There's even a Supreme Court decision, Defunis versus Odegaard, that recognizes that there's not a huge correlation between standardized test scores and how well one can do them, that they were actually implemented in the first place in order to restrict Jewish admission to Harvard, and it perpetuated. You can see it with other groups as well. The other thing I would say is you are still talking about a very high bar. Anyone who gets into, let's say, one of the UCs is immensely qualified, and the idea is around the edges in terms of, are we not only going to have a qualified pool, are we going to have a pool that represents the entire state? Right now, for example, 60% of Californians are Black or Latinx. Only 25% of UC students are Black or Latinx. Given the growing racially diverse population, it's not acceptable to set up basically an apartheid state where people of color are on the bottom of the hierarchy in terms of college, jobs, etc.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Lori, do we have any questions for either Erica or British? You're on mute.
Good evening, everyone. We do have a question from Ms. Morissette. She asked, what are the checks and balances that will be put in place after Proposition 15 passes? And why is it so hard to get this information simplified for the general public in a way that it's relatable? And that's related to Prop 15.
Oh, 15. We're on 16, but British can answer Prop 15 now, I guess.
Yeah, so for Prop 15, regarding the checks and balances, the text does indicate that annually every county or city, they have to report if they receive revenues. And I'm looking up because I'm looking at the text so I can give you the correct answer.
No, this is good.
So they have to publicly disclose for each fiscal year in their annual budgets the amount of property tax revenues they received for the fiscal year and how those revenues were spent. Those disclosures have to be made so that it's widely available to the public and written to be easily understood. And so that's the extent of how the text outlines the requirement for, I guess, transparency from that standpoint. Now, your second question about making these things easy, I don't have an answer for that. I would say legalities are never easy. And it's hard to make things plain English when you're talking about a law that has significant impact. So I think, Erica and Rashida can probably speak more from the legal perspective on that. But that's the best way I can answer. This is a law that's going into effect, and it's not going to necessarily be made in plain English because they have to consider so many different aspects. So,
yeah, easy is not a word that I would use with anything related to the law. Everyone is going to, figure out how to carve out their niche or whatnot. And that's why we actually all have to be on top of it. I mean, with this law and some that we're going to talk about even later in the show or in the forum, we're going to have to stay on top of it as these laws pass to make sure that they are actually implemented in the way that we want them to be implemented. Lori, did you also have a question for Prop 16?
I do. I have a question from Tim, and he would like how do you define the difference between equity and equality?
Okay, that's a good question. So equality means that everyone is being treated the same, right? That everyone is being held to the same, let's say, standards. Equity means that everyone's being treated fairly. And the distinction between those two things is that, let's say, Proposition 16 would recognize that the lived experiences of Black people in particular means that they've had to overcome substantial systemic racism and other barriers that make it less likely that they're going to have the ability to, let's say, only study and get the highest grades and test scores. No, the reality is many of us have to work and have other obstacles due to the history and modern current discrimination. That means that our path is not going to be the same as many other, let's say, white folks. And so an equity approach would realize that applying the same standard to everyone may be equality, but it's not equity. So when we talk about Prop 16, I do think it's important to talk about it in terms of equity instead of equality, because to treat everyone equally is not to treat everyone fairly and is not to obtain equity.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We are going to keep it moving.
I have one more question, Rashida.
Oh,
For 16.
okay.
I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. No, go ahead. We have to bring Erica back. Go ahead.
Okay. Erica, come back.
Well, she'll come back as you ask it. Go ahead.
Okay. Question is it true that Prop 16 would allow university and other government organizations to require a certain amount of diversity? For example, 40% minorities or 50% female to male ratio.
No, that is not true. What that would be a quota, and quotas are unconstitutional and illegal. What Prop 16 would do is it would allow the government universities to consciously attempt to get some amount of racial diversity. They wouldn't be allowed to put a certain number or percentage on it, but it would allow them, let's say, to look at two applicants to UCLA law and say, we only have one spot left. This person would add to the racial and ethnic diversity of our class, their life experience, etc. So we're going to give them the spot. Although in real life, that's not really what happens. What really happens is it's never, having served on many admissions committees, it's never that close. And so it's a myth that qualified white and Asian students are bumped out for students of color. I just wanted to get that in.
Thank you for getting that in, Erica. And, thanks so much for being here. I know it's, she's in North Carolina, so she's going straight to bed after this. So I really appreciate her being here and talking to us about this. But I'm telling you guys, I pulled strings to get you guys, the people on the street that are dealing with these issues, so that they can give you a real world answer. So she had to stay up a little late. She just had to do it. Okay, we're going to go back now to British, and we are going to skip to Prop 17.
Another fairly clear-cut proposition, and it will restore the right to vote after completion of prison term. This was also put on the ballot by the legislature, and the question we're asking is, should people on parole in California be allowed to register to vote in elections? And so as it stands now, the Constitution prohibits people in prison or on parole from voting. However, people in county jail or on probation are permitted to vote. So presently, we're looking at roughly 50,000 people that are on parole in California. The proposal for this proposition would restore voting rights to those on parole. So just keep in mind, if you have the right to vote, you also have the right to run for public office if qualified. And when we talk about the fiscal impact of this, overall, the concept is you're going to have more eligible voters. And so it's going to be more money to update the voter registration roll, which is a one-time fee, but also considering mailing out information to those voters on an ongoing basis, and just overall impact on the county elected officials. But the overall estimate is that it'll be less than 1% of the current general fund budget. And so arguments in favor of this communicate that when people complete their prison term, they should be encouraged to re-enter society and have a stake in their community. There are over 19 states that currently allow those on parole to vote. And once they're on parole, they're tax-paying citizens. They should be allowed the right to vote. Arguments against this communicate that it allows violent criminals to vote before they've completed their sentence, which should be considered to include parole. And also, this could be a bit of a smack in the face to the criminal's victims. And also, you haven't fully rehabilitated if you're still out on parole, so you shouldn't have the right to vote. And so, again, if you want to get some ideas about how much money was raised in favor or against this, you can see that. And just to recap, this is Prop 17. If you're voting yes, it would means that people on state parole who are U.S. citizens Residents of California and at least 18 years of age will be able to vote if they register. No vote means there will be no change, and those on parole would not be allowed to vote. And that's Prop 17. I'll turn it back over to Rashida.
Thank you, British. So I would like to say that this is like one of the most hotly contested propositions. You know, I don't know if everyone has seen the flyer with the little girl and she has like a black eye and the commercial comes on and it says we're about to let all of these criminals back into the street. So I decided to go to a criminal defense lawyer to see his thoughts on it. So I would like to bring in Jim DeSimone. While he's coming, you guys a little bit about him. He's the founder of the official name, V. James DeSimone Law, which is a litigating civil rights law firm. He is in the top 100 Southern California super lawyers, and he was honored as California Civil Rights Lawyer of the Year back in 2014. Jim, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So like I was saying when you were coming on, this is really a hotly contested proposition. Everyone is scared of letting all of these criminals back into the streets with this one. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And will that actually happen if people vote yes on this?
Well, this doesn't let anybody more in the streets. I mean, these are people who are already on parole. And the question is whether we are going to give them the vote when they're out on parole. And look, hundreds of thousands of people were marching in the streets this spring and this summer to call for racial justice and to call for criminal justice reform. And the reasons why they're out there is we see the system doesn't work. We already have mass incarceration, too many people in jail and prison. What studies show is that if you give the right to vote to people when they exit prison, that allows them and enables them to become more reintegrated into society. And it actually has a big effect on the recidivism rate. That less individuals who are given the right to vote in those 19 states where they're given the right to vote commit less crime that they end up going back to jail or prison for. And, you know, these folks come out, you know, they maybe they're supporting their family, maybe they have children. If they show their children they're voting and being part of the community, it just allows individuals who have served their time to become reintegrated into society. So I don't think this one should be as controversial. I think this should be a strongly yes vote for anyone. I mean, you know, if Florida can do it, right? I mean,
right.
Florida can do it, we could do it here in California. Right. And I think maybe it was a little bit of a hot potato. So the legislature said, well, we'll allow the will of the people to decide. And I think the will of the people should show we want to change society to get away from mass incarceration, to allow individuals to have an opportunity to succeed in society, and voting yes on Prop 17 is part of that movement that hopefully we can see through.
Yeah, there has been, you know, definitely a movement towards, you know, changing criminal laws, making it more, you know, equitable for people. But what do you say to people who are victims' rights? And they're saying like they're kind of cutting their rights short, like someone who is still on parole hasn't completely finished their sentence. What do you say to that?
Well, that they should be set up to best ensure that that person who is on parole isn't going to hurt anyone again, right? I mean, you know, so many of my clients, I'm not really a criminal defense lawyer, I'm a civil rights lawyer.
Right.
Clients, when they come to me and they've been harmed by someone else, you know, what they say is, I don't want this to happen to anybody else. And, you know, we can't account for all, you know, when people want vengeance against someone, you know, that's understandable when you deal with violent crimes, especially. But the most violent of criminals aren't going to ever see the light of day out of prison anyway. So I think explaining to them that this is a way to make sure that they don't do this, to help make sure that this that they won't do this to anybody else again, may help to at least make them feel better about this.
Okay. So now we're gonna open up to Lori, bring Lori and British back to see if we have anyone who has questions on Prop 17. I know that this is part of one of the propositions that's part of kind of the criminal reform that's been going on, that's sweeping the nation. You mentioned Florida getting rights for felons to vote, as well as other states as well. So this will kind of put California on the map. Are there questions, Lori, about this particular proposition?
Yes, there's a couple of questions actually. We have a
and
question.
Jim, we might need Jim to come back as well, all four of us. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, we have a question from Mr. Walker. Do you think people should be given a second chance after completing punishment? He likens it to, you know, if you get a DUI, should you never drive again? A second question we have is, what do you say to someone who argues that an offender's sentence is not completed just because they're no longer in prison? Technically, completion of parole, which has been ordered by a judge, is part of their sentence.
Well, again, I think that the person the decision has been made to let them out of prison and to get reintegrated into society. And if you're trying to have that individual reintegrated to society, then voting rights, we're all realizing now, right, how important the voting rights are now. We all realize it more than ever here, and that's why you have such interest in folks going out to the polls. Well, you don't want those folks feeling like they're disenfranchised, because that could lead them toward feeling more resentment and you know, perhaps committing more crime. So if this is a way to reduce criminal activity after people get out of prison, it's an important step to take.
Agreed. Well, thank you so much, Jim. Thank you for taking your time out. You're actually going to stay on because we have another proposition that we are going to run by you. But thank you so much for letting us, you know, pick your brain about Prop 17. And we are going to go on to Prop 20. And
can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you. We're good.
Okay, perfect. It cut out, so I wanted to make sure. Okay, so this is a good transition going from Prop 17 to Prop 20. And Prop 20 would restrict parole for certain offenses that are currently considered to be nonviolent. And this was also put on the ballot by petition signers. And just to kind of give you a little bit of background, right now, where we are with the legal system, felonies are considered the most severe crimes, and less severe crimes are called misdemeanors. And so if they get out of prison for a felony, they may do some time, they may spend some time on parole. But throughout time, there has been certain measures that were intended to kind of roll back some of the criminal justice. So we've had some criminal justice reform measures that have taken place dating back to 2011. And part of that was attributed to the need to reduce the state prison population. And so where we are today with this proposal is to reform the parole system so that violent felons are not released early from prison. And the objective of this proposition is to strengthen oversight of parole or probation. So that's post-release community supervision. And what it would do is change the information that will be provided to the local officials upon release. And also, if someone goes up for parole and they are denied early release, that inmate will become ineligible for early parole consideration for 2 years. The measure would also tighten penalties for violations of terms of parole. So if we had a repeat offender, 3 times they violated parole, then it will require counties to request that parole or probation be revoked for that individual. It also reforms theft laws to restore accountability for serial thieves and organized theft rings. I'm going to talk just a little bit about that on the next slide. The last thing that this bill would do is expand DNA collection from persons that were convicted of drug theft and domestic violence related crimes to help solve violent crimes and exonerate the innocent. And so when we talk about some of the specifics of this proposal, when I mentioned theft, right? Currently, most theft is identified as a misdemeanor, but under this proposition, it could either be a misdemeanor or a felony based on certain other factors. So they look at the value. Are you working in conjunction with other people? It takes a lot of different components in consideration, but it could be charged as either a misdemeanor or a felony. So just keep in mind that previously, this was considered a felony, and then we had a prior prop that made it a misdemeanor. So now we'll go back to being able to be either or. We already talked about the DNA collection that will be required as a result of this. And for individuals on parole, there will be additional information that could be provided at the parole hearing. So they could reach out to the victims' families or the victims themselves in order to get statements. And just kind of look at what the individual's plan is post-parole in order to make that determination. And if this goes into effect, the next to last bullet I want to highlight is that it applies to any inmate serving a sentence on or after the effective date, regardless of when the sentence was imposed. So this would be implemented immediately upon the effective date. And in terms of what could happen with this, the legislature would only be allowed to further impose, the legislature will only be allowed to create an impact that further pushes the purpose, the findings, and declarations of this act. And so that really goes back to the first slide where it talks about what the goals were for this proposition, and that would have to be by a 3/5 vote. So just kind of keep that in mind. If this goes into effect, the legislature does have the ability with the 3/5 vote to push this a little further. And so when we talk about the potential fiscal impact, this could increase the state and local costs by tens of millions of dollars annually, because it would result in increased prison population and also the way post-release supervision would be handled, right? Because they have to request additional information and they give a little more leeway to the parole officers. And so when we talk about the fiscal impact, it's correctional costs, court-related costs, as well as law enforcement costs. And when we look at some of the arguments that are in favor of this, those communicate that it reclassifies certain crimes like assault with a deadly weapon, date rape, and child abuse as violent. And so as the law currently stands now, for instance, if you are committed of sex trafficking, that's not considered a violent crime. So it's going to reclassify certain crimes of that nature. They argue that it would not increase the prison population. It would only ensure that those convicted of crimes serve their full sentence, and that it could help stop, car break-ins, things that are on the rise as it relates to theft. Those against this proposition point out that it will roll back prison reforms and cost taxpayers millions of dollars annually, and that it slashes mental health and rehabilitation programs. And it could result in extreme sentences for petty theft, and it would disproportionately impact vulnerable minorities. So again, here's just some information on the top contributors, how much has been raised for and against the proposition. And again, so Prop 20, we're asking, should the California law be amended to make changes to the process by which people are charged with certain crimes and the process for granting them parole? So we're looking at, how are we charging crimes? Is it going to be a felony or a misdemeanor? And how are we handling parole? Do you have the option for parole? Is it going to be delayed if you're rejected one time? So if you're voting yes, then you're saying, hey, yes, we should reclassify some of these crimes as violent. We should have limitations on parole and parole hearings. If you vote no, things will remain as they are. And I will turn it back over to Rashida.
Thank you so much, British. Okay, so this goes to the heart of some of the things that we've been talking here about NAN, which is, criminal justice reform. So I want to bring Tim back in to talk about this, because Tim, this kind of goes along with kind of the wave that, or goes against the wave that has been happening throughout the country, right? Like many different states and municipalities have been passing laws that make it that are told to be more smart on crime as opposed to tough on crime. And this kind of proposition makes it seem like they're trying to go back to being tough on crime. Can you let us know kind of how this would affect our community?
Once again, British for that extensive and technical definition.
Doing her thing, right?
Yeah, but what Proposition 20 really is, it's 3 strikes on steroids.
Mm.
The description in my title, Newly Empowered Voice, I'm one of those individuals who had a lesser offense doing the 3 strikes and ended up doing 21 years for something that I should have only did 16 months for.
Wow.
So this is a wicked piece of legislation that undermines all the criminal justice reform of the last 10 years. AB 109 was enacted because the prisons were overcrowded because of 3 strikes and individuals were dying and they could not take care of folks. That's what that was about. Prop 47 got individuals out because of the 3 strikes law. They were criminalizing individuals with enormous sentences for things like drug possession. And that is injustice. And when you talk about Prop 57, it's not about incentivizing doing time alone. What Prop 57 really was about, because of the 3 strikes law, prosecutors across California had the arbitrary right to try an individual as young as 14 years old and send them to adult prison.
Wow.
So prisons were starting to look like junior high schools and high schools because they were criminalizing mistakes that these youngsters was making before their decision-making process was fully set in place. Those who are proponents of this believe that individuals should be in jail for whatever they do. That is better to invest in the expansion of prison population than it is to invest in care over cages. And if you're talking about recriminalizing 51 new felonies and dropping the felony monetary ceiling, which Proposition 47 set at $950, Prop 20 wants to drop it to $250.
Wow.
And also create a space where you can commit 3 crimes as if it is within 90 to 180 days. They can take those 3 crimes and put them together and make them worth more than $250 and charge you with a felony. So what this is an attack on the Black and brown communities that lived in the margins, and individuals who often make bad decisions and engage in crimes of need, not crimes of greed. And they use the term violent to like get people's fears up so they can leverage it. But all crimes aren't violent. And when you say like sex trafficking is not considered to be violent, when most individuals are charged in that space, they're charged with human trafficking. Human trafficking is a felony offense, a federal offense, and the time starts at 10 years and can go to 25 years. And whenever they charge an individual, a person of color, Black or brown, or somebody that's broke, they go for the highest charge that equals the most extensive amount of time possible when an individual is convicted. So to not vote no on Prop 20 is a vote for tens of billions of dollars to be reinvested back in the prison population. It's a vote for communities to be further decimated. It's a vote for individuals not getting the trauma-informed care that they need. There aren't a bunch of vicious individuals running around committing these violent crimes. There's a statistics demonstrate that violent crime is being reduced. Petty crimes are being packaged to seem like there's an increase in crime. And the statisticians who are proponents of locking the individual up and throwing away the key, they're using numbers to generate like a fear-based way of thinking. But we cannot let our fears be activated because there's a small portion of our population that wants to see individuals, predominantly of African Americans and Latinx, in prison.
Yeah, I actually read that the crime has steadily declined overall and hit a record low since hit a record low in 2019. So that's actually good news. I wanted to bring Lori and British on to see if we have more questions. Lori, did you get any questions about Prop 20 for either Tim or British?
I do have a question for Tony. What do you say to people who say child abuse, domestic violence, hate crimes, and aggravated assault are not on the violent felonies list but should be?
Well, for me to answer that is not true. Abuse and assault are serious and violent crimes already. It is just an attempt to highlight those crimes to cut into individuals' emotions because of the emotions that arise when you use those terms, and it makes people want to lash out and to extract some degree of revenge. But there are already laws on the books to address that, and all this would be is overkill. And you should not punish the many going after like a single and smaller population of individuals who do things of that nature.
Right, right. Well, thank you so much. We definitely, we are going to have our voters guide online, and our voters guide, actually, NAN has voted no on 20. Obviously, we're leaving it up to you guys after hearing information, but that's a big one. Like I said earlier, there has been a wave of criminal justice reform, and California has been at the forefront of that wave. And I think that Prop 20 is one of the propositions that are trying to kind of cut into that. So definitely look out for that one on your ballot. And with that, we are moving on to Prop 21, which is yet another hot and steamy proposition on the ballot. It's something also near and dear to my heart, rent control. British, can you please let us know? Because one thing that is hearing about rent control is when it works, it doesn't work, it has negative effects. Maybe you can break down some of the facts about it and see if we can clear some of this stuff.
Thank you, Rashida. And I'll say, yes, I'm glad that my presentations are technical, because that means you don't know what my position is, which is the whole objective. And so now we'll get into Prop 21, which would expand local government's authority to enact rent control on residential property. Now, just some basic background. Most of us live in California. We know the rent is high. I know there's a different phrase used for that, but I'll say it that way. But there are several cities that have rent control laws in place, and there's a court ruling that limits local rent control, and it does require landlords to receive a fair rate of return. Now, state law limits local rent control, and that's under Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act, and that was passed in 1995. And within that state law, it also limits the rent increases while someone is in the unit, but there is no limit once the person vacates. And again, we're going back to this property taxes and property taxes, one of the largest sources of tax revenues that the state has at this point. And so the proposal for this proposition would be to allow cities and counties to apply rent control to more properties than currently under law. And what would happen is, as of right now, with Costa-Hawkins, rent control could be applied on properties from 1995. And this would allow rent control to be placed on properties that are over 15 years old. And how that age will be determined is based on the certificate of occupancy of the property. Now, whereas Costa-Hawkins explicitly excludes single-family residences from rent control, this proposal would only exclude single-family residences to the extent that the owner does not have more than 2 properties. If the owner has more than 2 homes that are being rented out, they will be subject to rent control. In addition, the proposition would limit how much a landlord can increase rents when a new renter moves in. So right now, once the tenant moves out, the landlord can raise the rents as high as they want, up to market value or whatever price they want to charge. What the proposition would do would limit it to a maximum of 15% during the first 3 years. And so I've had questions like, oh, well, could it be 5% or 10%? The state would have a limit of 15% maximum 15% for the first 3 years. Now, keep in mind, this proposition would allow the cities and counties to affect their own rent control. And so the cities and counties could say, well, we know we have a max of 15% for 3 years, but maybe we only want the max to be 10, or we want it to be 5. So it'll be very subjective based on locality, how that could be applied. But just keep in mind, the max is 15% over 3 years. But the proposition continues to require a fair rate of return. And so the first 3 bullets on here that I've discussed, those would basically amend Costa-Hawkins Act. So just keep that in mind. Now, when we talk about the fiscal impact, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but it's going to be different based on the locality and how they choose to affect rent control. And there are just various things that could happen. Maybe the landlords decide to sell the rental properties. There could be a decline in rental housing values, and that's primarily because the money that they're earning would go down because rent control will be put into place, and that has a direct effect on the value of the property. It could result in higher rent in existing properties because they want to make up. If it's a landlord that has multiple properties, maybe they need to make up for what they're losing somewhere else. Others impacts are just, it could limit construction of new rental housing because the market rate for rent could be impacted by the fact that more properties are subject to rent control. And over time, it would reduce state and local revenues. If they're getting less for rent, they're paying less. The property values are less, they're paying less in property taxes. And lastly, the cost of rent boards could increase because they'll be enacting rent control for more areas and more properties, so that could increase their costs. And so when we look at some arguments in favor of this, it keeps families in their homes, it guarantees landlords a reasonable profit, and rent control can be a helpful tool for cities struggling with gentrification, displacement, and homelessness. Arguments against this communicate that rent control, it results in less available and less affordable housing, and it could stop new housing from being built and cost jobs and hurt the economy. And so if you want to follow the money, you can see how much was raised in favor and against this. And I'll just point out that the AIDS Healthcare Foundation raised the majority of all the money in favor of it. And again, this is Prop 21. A yes vote means that you want state law to allow cities and counties to apply more stringent rent control to more properties than currently under law. And a no vote means that there will be no change in rent control from the state perspective, and it will remain the same. And I'll turn it back to Rashida.
Thanks, British. I mean, rent control is always an issue here in Los Angeles, but it's even been more of an issue with the pandemic and people getting laid off. And so this is very much a hot button topic on our ballot. I am bringing in Renee from the 21 organization. Renee, thank you so much for being here. You're still on mute.
Thank you for being here. No, thank you for having me. And again, thank you for giving that succinct sort of overview of Prop 21. I did want to clarify just a couple of things I think that are important for your listeners to really, kind of get informed about. I mean, first and foremost, on the question of rent boards and the cost of that, a lot of cities that have rent control don't have rent boards. So the city of LA, for example, doesn't have a rent board, but we have a form of rent control that can apply only to buildings built before October 1st, 1978. And so, again, a lot of these costs are really dependent on what local cities end up deciding to do. So I just wanted to be very clear about that. And the other thing about the 15%, the way that is meant to work is that the 15% would be charged before new renters move into an apartment, so that, again, the new renter wouldn't feel the effect of the increase, but at the same time, it would allow us to preserve that housing as affordable in the long run. So just wanted to clarify those items there very quickly.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess one of the bigger questions too is I know that we've all been told there was rent control in San Francisco and it didn't really work out, and people are, it's kind of connected to there being less housing. Can you talk a little bit about that? How do you combat that? Because housing is definitely a problem here in Los Angeles.
Well, first and foremost, we do have rent control in Los Angeles, right? As we all know, we have it in San Francisco. We have it in a number of cities. The real problem, though, is that there are two giant loopholes in state law right now that limit that rent control. The first one is this law that's called the Ellis Act, which makes it very easy, in particular for developers and landlords, to remove rent-controlled units from the market. It's why right now in the city of LA, we are losing 5 or 6 rent-controlled apartments every single year. They're being destroyed, so that the number of units under rent control in LA has actually been declining for the last 25 years. The second big loophole is the one that we've been talking about, which is the Costa-Hawkins Act. And what the Costa-Hawkins Act was meant to do was to essentially end rent control. It's why the LA Times at the time when the law came into effect in 95, it had as its blaring headline that the era of rent control was over, right? That was the whole point, to try to eliminate rent control. And what was the net effect? You know, the net effect was that, you know, we've seen massive gentrification and displacement in our communities. As someone, I personally wrote the majority of Prop 21 myself, the law. I had a little bit of legal training when I was younger.
Okay.
But I wrote it in particular because for me, I grew up in Northeast LA in Highland Park that used to be predominantly Latino, working class. And little by little, this entire community has completely changed about, you know, removing a lot of the older community and really pushing out friends, family members that I had. It was, you know, very, very deeply troubling to me over the last 10 years. And so that is something that I think I want to mention. But the final thing, to the point that you made about construction of housing, the USC Price Institute 2 years ago released a study called Rent Matters that actually looked at the academic literature and the statistics to see what actually was the real impact of rent control and rent controls on the construction of new housing. And the result of that study was that actually rent control has little impact on new construction. And in fact, this is borne out by our experience. The city of San Francisco, for example, has stronger rent controls than cities around it in the Bay Area. And yet the construction of housing in San Francisco is still at a far higher rate than it is in the cities that surround it that don't have rent control. Number one, here in LA, it's the same thing. The city of LA, we're not lacking in cranes outside building housing, although we have to build more housing, one. And two, we have to build more truly affordable housing if we're ever actually going to solve this issue. But in terms of the construction of housing, LA, the city of LA, has built more housing than a lot of the jurisdictions around it that don't have rent control. The city of Santa Monica here in Southern California, again, has tended to have one of the stronger forms of rent control. It actually has been meeting its RENA goals. In other words, the state standards for construction of new housing every year, despite the fact, especially recently, despite the fact that it has stronger rent control. And then again, this is why that study basically concludes with that, right? That all of these purported negative effects of rent control, they first off are theoretical. They're based on kind of like very simplistic supply and demand arguments on the one hand, and on the other, the empirical evidence, what actually has happened, has not been borne out by that. And I'd like to say a little bit more on construction, Rashida, maybe later on, but I'd like to answer a question. I know there's one waiting.
Yeah, there's one ready. We're going to bring Lori in and see if she can get that question to you.
Yes, we have a question from Ms. Morissette. She wants to know how quickly will rent control go into effect if the proposition is approved?
That's a fantastic question. Our initiative, like most ballot initiatives, becomes law the moment that the Secretary of State of California certifies it as having passed. So at the moment that we get certification, the city of LA could choose to enact rent control immediately and cover the vast majority of units in our city. The city of LA, by the way, has already said that it wants to do that. We all know that because of the pandemic, a lot of people are struggling to pay their rent. But because of the Costa-Hawkins Act, the law that we're trying to amend with Prop 21, our city and our mayor cannot expand the existing rent freeze that exists in LA. Right now, if you are living in a rent controlled unit, if you have a unit that's under RSO, you cannot have the rent raised on you, at least right now during this emergency period when people are losing their jobs en masse, or people are working fewer hours, etc. But because of that law, because of Costa-Hawkins that was signed into law by Pete Wilson, who I personally am no fan of, because of that law, our mayor and our city council cannot expand that protection to cover buildings built after 1978. And that's scandalous. All of our renters, and in particular renters living in older housing, who tend to be poorer, who tend to be, making median wages, who tend to be people of color, they should be able to be protected by our city council. And right now their hands are tied. Prop 21 would uncuff our city and let it do more.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. Lori, is there any other questions for Prop 21? Nope. Okay. Thank you so much, Renee. That is like a huge issue, especially here in Inglewood with the stadium going up. I mean, again, we have the emergency rent control, but after that, people are very nervous. So that is definitely something that we should all pay attention to. All right, moving on, bringing British back for Prop 2. Hi.
Hello. All right. So now we have Proposition 22. I think this is probably another heavy hitter on the ballot this year. And basically what you're asking is, should app-based rideshare and delivery drivers be classified as independent contractors and not employees? And with that, they will require rideshare and delivery companies to adopt labor and wage policies that are unique to these drivers. And so just a little background, and I thought this was interesting. I should have known, but I didn't until I read this, is that most large rideshare and delivery companies are headquartered here in California. And right now they hire drivers as independent contractors. So in 2019, AB 5 passed, and it limited the ability of companies to hire workers as independent contractors. And so it said that you had to classify drivers as employees instead, and you have to provide them with employee protections. However, the companies do not agree that the new state law makes their drivers employees, and they have continued to classify their drivers as independent contractors. And so the proposal for this proposition would be to make the drivers independent contractors. In addition to that, the companies would be required to compensate at 120% of minimum wage when they drive, pay for health insurance if they drive more than 15 hours per week, cover medical costs if they're injured while working, and they will restrict the drivers to no more than 12 hours a day for a rideshare or delivery company. And then they have to, develop harassment policies, conduct criminal background checks, and mandate safety training driving. So that's what the proposition requires. And of course, it prohibits workplace discrimination. And when you look at the fiscal impact of this, you are looking at lower costs and higher profits for rideshare and delivery companies. That's as the proposition communicates. And the drivers and stockholders would pay more in income taxes. And so the concept is that the companies are making more money, and so the companies will pay more in income taxes, and the stockholders will have a higher return, things of that nature, right? And the amount of increase of taxes is unknown, but they're saying that it would likely be minor. And when we look at arguments that are in favor of this, it points out that prohibiting independent contract work, it would eliminate hundreds of thousands of jobs, because a lot of people prefer to be an independent contractor because it provides more flexibility, and limiting that would eliminate the flexibility and thereby eliminating people's ability to drive. And it would keep rideshare and food delivery services available, affordable, and safe. And it would improve delivery and rideshare work just because of the additional requirements that the companies would have. Arguments against this point out that it would eliminate basic workplace protections and replaces them with lower guaranteed earnings and healthcare subsidies to save costs for the company. And that the current law does not limit driver flexibility because most drivers work over 30 hours a week anyway. And the current law would, it requires requires companies to provide their drivers with a lot of the things that this proposition is suggesting, and in a better format. So they have to provide paid sick leave, healthcare, things of that nature. And just like every other business, that's what's already being required if they follow AB 5. Those are the arguments. And if you want to follow the money, yes, you can guess who's in favor of this just by looking, and those who are opposed. And again, for Prop 22, the question is, should these app-based and delivery drivers be classified as independent contractors? If you agree that they should, you would vote yes. If you disagree, then you would vote no. And that covers Prop 22. I know that was a little quick, but I'll turn it back over to you, Rashida.
Listen, quick is never a problem, especially on a Wednesday night. And you covered it well, actually. I'm not sure. We, again, have our NAN LA's voter guide is out. And you'll notice that NAN LA is neutral on this subject. We have ties with both people who are fighting for rideshare drivers to be considered independent employees or independent contractors, and we are closely related to unions who think that they should be considered employees. We obviously have done a lot of research on this ourselves, and we can definitely see both points. So we wanted to talk about it a bit more extensively here tonight. So I'm going to bring in one of my faves, Reverend K.W. Toulis. Reverend K.W. Toulis, for many of you guys know, was actually the president of NAN before Reverend Mosley became president. Now he is over the Baptist Ministers Conference of LA, but we love him so much, so we don't let him go too far. We never let him get too far. Rev, I know that you are very much for Prop 22. We are also working very closely with the Black Labor Table, who couldn't join us tonight, but has sent a couple representatives, and they are against Prop 22. Can you tell me why you think Prop 22 is helpful for members of our community?
It's quite simple. I'm a labor guy. I've probably been to jail for labor more than any preacher, any pastor in California the last 3 or 4 years. I'm a person that believes in the rights of labor, what the workers want, standing for what workers want. And it's quite simple why I'm yes on 22. Has nothing to do with labor or the AB 5 bill that was passed through the Sacramento this past year. But it has everything to do with the workers. Over 80% of the workers who drive and perform these app-based services are individuals, again, that want to remain independent. They don't want to work for Uber. They don't want to work for Lyft. They want to remain independent. And at the end, I'm sticking with the workers at all times. These are workers, again, who's able to develop a schedule around their own timing, who's able to work at their own leisure. And Prop 22 will give them that opportunity and remain independent from Uber. Whatever happened to the spirit of entrepreneurship? They want to work when they want to work. I, myself, as many knew, in the midst of some transitions in my life, I've had to pick up employment through ride shares. And I could not imagine me being at rallies and me being at my church that I pastor if I had to be there at a set time. It gave me flexibility. And we're living in a time of pandemic, and I think all of us have utilized these services. These are individuals that drive us to various destinations. These are individuals that deliver our food, deliver our medicine, deliver our packages. And at the end of the day, we have to stick with the workers. Special interests, again, I just don't. This is why we, as I'm part of a coalition, Clergy for 22, which is also spearheaded by Reverend Jonathan Mosley and Reverend Porter from National Action Network. And we're going to do whatever we can to stick with these workers because, again, Prop 22 will provide those services. And we have to be more in tune to what the workers want, not what we want to, just stop this business. And let me also say this. It's been many times I lived in South LA and I've called cabs that never picked me up. I never had an opportunity I've never called Uber or Lyft or any other the car services that did not come and pick me up in my neighborhood and drop me off where I needed to be. And I know it's controversial, but at the end of the day, we must do whatever we can to protect and stand with the workers. And that's what I'm doing. 80% of those who are driving want to remain independent, and we must continue to honor their request to remain independent.
Yeah, no, I definitely have talked to a few workers. I've only know a couple workers that independent drivers that want to remain independent. But I've also talked to a few people of the union. And what do you say to, one of the issues that we have about this at NAN is that it kind of creates a dangerous precedent, right? California is known for being one of the states that is very worker friendly. We have, OT hours. We get double OT. I saw that in the proposition or whatever, they will give some wages for that. But here in California, we're very liberal as far as we get double OT. They don't even get double OT in some other states. Our sick leave, they offer sick leave in this proposition, but our sick leave standards are much higher, which actually supports and helps workers. So for me, it was more like a short term versus a long term. I know that workers that are working short term now want to stay independent. But what happens when, they're sick and they can't, get the same amount of sick leave that their friends that are working other jobs get, or they don't get the same amount of hours, OT hours that their other friends get. I think that one of the issues that we had is that some of the protections that workers here in California get are kind of being passed by these huge billion-dollar companies that are just not willing to put that money up.
Let me say and answer your question this way. Again, 80% of those who drive rideshare are doing it at a part-time level. So most of the time, people are using this income to help subsidize whatever bills it goes to subsidize whatever. In the midst of a pandemic, so many people laid off and many people are driving just to bring in some extra income. So a lot of individuals, I can understand for that worker that want to make this a living, drive full time, that many of those benefits should probably be looked into. But Prop 22, again, it provides 80% of the drivers who are driving. This is what they want. And I understand that we want to look out for their needs. And I do believe 22, they're going to benefit. They're going to be able to get health care. They're going to be able to get protection. They're going to be able to get $25 an hour. These are part-time opportunities for individuals like me who have taken advantage of this in the past, who helped subsidize and paid our bills. A lot of people don't jump into driving Uber looking at that being a career of driving their own car to make a living. A lot of people do it, again, for part-time. And if we don't pass Prop 22, there's an opportunity that it will kill the whole service industry as a whole. Because, again, well, I don't know.
I think I would be willing to call their bluff on that. California is one of the biggest states in the country. If you're going to tell me as Uber you're going to pull out of California, I think I'd call your bluff.
I'm gonna say this to you. California set the lead, and so again, there's an opportunity if this don't pass. Again, one of the biggest concerns my daughter had a few weeks ago was, Dad, how am I going to get home from school when Uber and Lyft is saying that they're about to pull out? They called us bluff, and I guess California bit because they loosened and they extended their exemption to the end of the year. So at the end of the day, again, we at the Baptist Ministers Conference, Clergy for 22, we're standing with the workers, not with our special interests, not with any of those, the people that's actually doing the job. They want to remain independent, and we should support their independence.
No,
It's their right.
definitely, I agree. I agree that you're standing with the workers. I think there's arguments for the workers on both sides, but let's see if there's questions for the workers on both sides. Lori, can you come in and let us know if we have any questions?
We have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Ms. Morissette says, regarding remaining independent as rideshare drivers, how do we then provide protections for drivers who can't apply for unemployment or health insurance because of loss of wages due to the pandemic?
Well, one of the beauties of Prop 22, again, it will provide workers who works 10 hours a week with access to health care. Any workers that's doing more than 10 hours a week, it will provide those healthcare services to them. And when we work independent, we know, again, as independent workers, we know that certain benefits are not given to us, such as unemployment and things of that matter. Maybe we can develop and really advocate our legislation, our assembly and our Senate to develop some sort of policy where it would look out for those of us who choose and want to work independence. Forcing individuals to work under a set schedule for a company is something, again, we would never stand for. And we have to stand with 80% of the workers. That's why we're saying yes on 22.
One thing I would interject on that is with COVID, under the recent pandemic, there was an opportunity for certain independent contractors to receive unemployment benefits. And so that's something else to just keep in mind, because these are extenuating circumstances. And I don't know, anybody can call their hairstylist who wasn't able to work, or like they were able to get unemployment under COVID.
And I think that should.
But once COVID is over, that is not something that's going to be afforded to them. And speaking of insurance, as in unemployment insurance, you know, there's also issues with insurance, like your car gets hurt, or, you know, you get hurt on the job that's not actually, you know, getting into an accident. One of the problems is a lot of those costs have, if you're an independent contractor, it passes on to the independent contractor, and it doesn't allow for the employer to be held accountable. Go ahead.
This is what independent workers, this is what working independently is all about. You take on the cost. You have other structures that you can push that income towards. As British shared, I mean, if they can do it for pandemic times and opening up unemployment insurance, there should be some sort of pot in California. Let's take the lead. Let's advocate for some sort of pot for those who choose to work independent, because again, this is 80% of the workers. This is what they want. They want to remain independent, and they don't want to work for Uber. They don't want to work for Lyft. They want to work for themselves. They want to work when they want to work, when they get off of work. You know, they want to put in a couple hours. The shoemate, Victor, all of them, they want to work when they want to work. And so at the end of the day, again, I'm standing with the workers, and I'm going to keep pushing yes on 22. And I'm a fan. Like I said, I'm a labor guy. Everybody know it. I love labor. I love workers. I fight for them. And at the end of the day, I just think it was just too many hidden agendas when it came to this.
Listen, Miss Shoemate, Victor are some of our best.
I gave them a shout out.
I know they're one of our most loyal members, so I'm definitely standing with them. And we just definitely want to make sure that they have as many protections as needed. Lori, is there another question for 20?
They're coming in for 22.
22, that's what we're on. 22. Rev, come back up here. I'm sure they have more questions for you.
The next question.
Whoever's controlling the screen.
No, I know. I'm just playing. I know.
It's on purpose. You know. I know it's hot. I'm on. I'm KW2. So
let's go. Let's go.
Until I die. Come on. Bring it. I'm here.
Go ahead, Lori. Sorry.
Question from Mr. Walker. Do you think it could be made more equitable by splitting a larger portion of the income?
I think that's something that should be negotiated through the workers. That's something that we should advocate for through legislation, upcoming legislation. I think that it should be fair and equitable, and I do hear all the concerns, but I believe that, again, as they have developed policies to help the individuals, they can develop it for everybody involved. One of the things that we have seen is how essential these services are. I mean, when it comes to medicine, we have seen that these last 7 months, pandemic, lockdown, I mean, Grubhub, Postmates, I mean, has become a lot of our best friends. And at the end, I think we need to bring everybody to the table, and everybody should be given their best share. But again, we should not do anything that's going to impact those who are front line and doing these services and putting themselves at risk for us.
Yeah, and just to be clear, like, it's possible for someone to be an employee and still make their own schedule. I think one of the things that I heard from contractors who wanted to stay contractors is like they love being able to get off work and jump in a car and make a couple dollars, or do that. And so I definitely understand that. I definitely, especially in this time, needing to supplement your work check, and I get that. So that doesn't necessarily mean that becoming an employee does not would hamper that. But also on the flip side of things, I just want to say, unions, it's been one thing that's also has been great with independent contractors is it allows for a lot more people to get into that job. One thing that we saw at NAN is it's hard sometimes when things have been unionized or whatever for our people to kind of get in. And so that's obviously noted as well. So listen, this is why NAN LA has shown both sides of this, because we know that a lot of people are affected, and we wanted to make sure that we kind of talked about both sides of the coin so that people can make informed decisions. Lori, did you have another question?
We do, from Mr. He's asking, what about safety issues, both for drivers and passengers, with assaults, when drivers get in accidents with minimum insurance? Drivers' employees hold both Uber and Lyft accountable. And his question is, couldn't companies still allow for flexible schedules? Which, if I can answer that as a labor, my labor hat on for a second, flexibility in schedules is something that can always be bargained. And, labor is about the workers too. That's the point in life. We are about the workers. And this industry is heavily African American. What we don't want to see, that we've seen happen, gig jobs end up turning into careers for people because of different issues with the economy. So now a gig job or a career job, and you have no protections. You don't have the worker compensation. You don't have a voice. A voice as an independent contractor and or at-will employee. And just a small point, the survey that was given to the workers was company driven. It wasn't independent driven. Side note.
Okay.
That's all.
Is that it for the questions?
No.
Okay, one more and then we have to move on. So pick a good one.
This is a hot topic.
This is a hot topic. It's 7:40.
We have an anonymous question. Does Pastor Toulis believe these workers deserve a union?
I believe that the workers, if they want a union, they should have a union. And I would be the first to stand with the workers if they want to unionize. And I believe, again, that's all part of the process. We should hear from the people. Hopefully it's a Black labor union.
As in Black labor table. Good answer, Rev. Good answer. All right. Thank you so much. Again, obviously, this is a hot topic. I've been in a couple passionate conversations about this, so I'm glad we were able to get this in. Rev, thank you so much for being on. We will see you again. NAN doesn't let you go too far, so we'll see you soon. And now we are going to throw it back to British for Proposition 25. Yeah. Mute. We can't hear you.
Sorry.
Okay. There you go.
Okay, so this is the last proposition that I'll be covering this evening. There is still Measure J, but Prop 25 is another heavy hitter, and it deals with some sort of criminal justice reform to a degree. And remember when I started speaking at the beginning of this, I said we have one proposition that's a referendum. That is this one, Prop 25. And what it means for it to be a referendum is that if you vote yes, you are approving the bill that was previously passed. If you vote no, you do not approve the bill and it will not go into effect. And so the question that we're asking is, should the law enacted by California legislature to replace the current monetary bail system be approved? And so just to give you some background, currently, if people are arrested, they're placed in county jail, but they have the right to release before trial. And there are certain things that the trial courts have to consider: the seriousness of the crime, the criminal record of the individual, and the likelihood of them appearing in court. And so if they are able to be released from jail before trial, excuse me, it could occur in two ways: either on their own recognizance, or they would have to do bail. So they would have to pledge assets or cash. And basically that would be obtaining a financial guarantee from a bail bond company, excuse me. So in 2018, the legislature passed SB 10, which eliminated the cash bail system. SB 10 did not go into effect because this referendum was filed. Okay, so this is where we are today. And so SB 10, this is a referendum, and it's going to determine whether or not SB 10 goes into effect. So we have, if you say yes, there would be a new bail and pretrial law. If you say no, there will be no change. Again, it would eliminate release on bail and would create a new process for release before arraignment. And so it would, just to give you a little bit of information about the release. So if it was a misdemeanor, most misdemeanors would provide for an automatic release. Now, keep in mind, if we had a previous proposition that was trying to reclassify certain crimes from misdemeanors to felonies. So this has an impact, right? The other thing is that release for felonies and some misdemeanors would require an assessment. And so each individual would be assessed. Some people are saying it would be based on artificial intelligence, but they would take certain factors in consideration to determine, is this person a risk of not appearing in court? And based on the results of that assessment, you would be rated low, medium, or high risk. So if you're high risk, you would stay in jail. If you're low risk, you would be released pending trial. Medium risk, it's up to the judge. So this is also showing you why judge elections are important. And so the trial courts are responsible for carrying out this pretrial assessment, and the text goes into a little bit of detail about how they could implement that. They could try to develop their own system. They could outsource it to another group. So there's still some flexibility as it relates to this assessment and how it will be done. And the proposal would also change the process for release at arraignment. And in general, you'll be released on your own recognizance. And so when we look at the fiscal impact of this, it would increase the state and local pretrial costs because, again, this new release process would cause a release increased workload, as well as this assessment that would have to be completed. The expectation is that it would decrease county jail costs because it would reduce the population within the county jail because more people would be automatically released. And in terms of the impact on state and local revenues, it varies. So there could be a reduction because there's no bail bond fees, or the bail bond companies are not paying property taxes or income taxes, things of that nature. But then the alternative example is, well, because people aren't paying bond, they have more disposable income and they might spend their money more, and that could result in higher sales tax. So just so you have an understanding of what the fiscal impact is communicated and how it's communicated in the prop itself. And so when we look at arguments in favor and against this proposition, this referendum, it points out, and those in favor say money bail is unfair, it's unsafe, and it's costly. Innocent people suffer, and that system doesn't really care about our communities. Those against it say that it's more biased. It could be more biased against minorities and the poor as it relates to the assessment process. It could make the communities less safe because it's going to allow more people to get out. And it could deny justice and overburden an already overcrowded court system and would cost taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars each year. And so if you want to follow the money, you know, I'm assuming you know who's against it, the bail bond companies. Those are the top 3 bail bond companies. And for Prop 25, again, this is a referendum. So if you're voting yes, you say, yes, I want to eliminate cash bail and I want SB 10 to go into effect. If you say no, SB 10 will not go into effect. There will be no change. And there's also a limitation on the ability to bring that bill back to the floor again. And so that's Prop 25. And I'll turn it back over to Rashida.
Thanks, British. So I will admit right now, Prop 25, I think, was the most confusing for me. I did a bit of research on this one. And one of the main things that I was confused about is like it was eliminating bond, which seems very, very liberal. But a lot of the liberal organizations that I know are liberal and that do great work are actually against this proposition. So I'd like to bring back Jim DeSimone so that we could talk a bit more about this because I'm confused or I was confused. And I'd love for him to kind of explain to everyone why the ACLU are against Prop 25. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Rashida. Yeah, I thought that was a great breakdown by British, and thank you for all this information. Yeah, at first blush, it sounds like a great idea, right? Get rid of cash bail. It makes it fair for lower income individuals to get, you know, we're innocent until proven guilty, right? So why should people be incarcerated for so long when they haven't been adjudicated for the crimes? So the goal is laudable, but this is a bad bill. Human Rights Watch opposes it, ACLU opposes it. And although I initially was in favor of it, as I began to read more on it and talk to the colleagues that I trust, I became convinced that this a no vote if you should really be given on this bill. And this is why. What's used to evaluate whether someone is at low, medium, or high risk? Well, it's an algorithm. So it's not really looking at the specific instances of who that individual is as a person, what ties they have to community. And one of the things that feed into that algorithm is race. So they are looking at a race-based algorithm that could be used against individuals who are African American, Latino, and basically have them hold over that incarceration because most people are going to fit into that middle level. So what ends up happening? Well, there are studies that show that 75% or more people plead guilty just to get out of jail pre-trial. You know, it's like, oh, if I plead guilty, I get out. Okay. Even if you didn't commit the crime, you might plead guilty because you want to get out of the horrible conditions, especially our LA County Jail down on Boucher Street, which is a hellhole, right? So I committed civil disobedience once at UCLA. I went to UCLA Law School to Rashida back in 1985. And I spent one night there in the anti-apartheid movement. Enough for me. But, you know, looking at it. So what ends up happening? The judges and the prosecutor put pressure on that individual. And you notice that for the mid-level risk assessments, the judges have absolute and total discretion as to whether or not to keep that person pretrial incarcerated. So one of the bullet points that British put up, you know, said, you know, one thing that for it is that it will lead to less pretrial incarceration. People who work with the system every day actually think that it will increase pretrial incarceration because you're going to have judges who now are given this type of discretion, and they don't have, you know, they may lean towards, you're talking about, you know, law and order as we hear. You're talking about, you know, then it's going to be totally judge determinative as to whether somebody can see the light of day. Now, there are all sorts of problems with the bail system, but Right now, we have a legislature that is hearing the will of the people. I was a big advocate of SB 731, where we tried to get the, basically the police officers decertified who were repeat offenders, tried to get that done.
Yes,
I was on a forum yesterday with Steve Bradford, who was one of the authors of that.
Yes.
And, he said that's going to come up, one of the first bills. I mean, people were a little afraid of these police unions, obviously, in not passing that. But criminal justice reform is at the forefront of the legislators' minds. We have an election coming up. This bill kind of entrenches a bad system to allow people who will be to remain incarcerated. And at least with bail, it's not a great system, but you got a shot, right? I mean, if it sets bail, at least you have an opportunity.
I want to push back a little bit on that, only because the system that we have right now for the bail system is we know it's problematic, right? Like all throughout the country. It reminds me of the Khalif Browder story with Jay-Z. Everyone's seen the commercial with the guy that from San Francisco that stole something from the convenience store, stayed in for years, where the young guy who had money, who actually raped someone, was able to get out. And so one of the things that I definitely hear the argument for the algorithms being problematic, but what do you say to people who say, why not start here and then just push further with more case law and more legislation to make sure that the algorithms aren't, racially driven? Like one thing we do know now is the system that we have doesn't work. We know that across America, 6 out of 10 people are in jail waiting trial. You know what I mean? So there's actually more people in jail because of, bail issues than there are people who are actually convicted. So I think the stance that a lot of people are taking is like, let's get rid of what we have now and then make it better, as opposed to kind of waiting on this legislation that is going to be a bit more perfect. Because, you and I know as lawyers, there's no perfect legislation.
Well, that's a very good question. And of course, it raises the concern that I share and many share, that people should not be incarcerated waiting trial just because they can't afford. So you look at the exemption of certain types of crimes for pretrial incarceration should be expanded.
Mm-hmm.
What is limited in this bill is, in terms of the changes that can come, it has to come from the trial courts. Mm-hmm. So, I don't think that, you're really getting kind of a progressive view within the trial court. So, mm-hmm. In California, we have, in the state as a whole, I think, a progressive liberal electorate, obviously conservative elements, but it's
comparatively, definitely.
Comparatively speaking. So, who do you trust more to get this done? Are the legislature that we're going to be voting for, and the legislators that we're going to be voting for, or the trial court? So, it's a fair question. I'm not saying that I 100% know the answer as to how this get accomplished, but what we, John Raflin is a senior researcher for Human Rights Watch. He wrote an article on this, and he's someone who was a public defender and has been working in the community homeless assistance project in Venice. Really a committed person. I had a talk with him about this, and he said, we are putting forth proposals in order to basically get people out of jail who are faced with those situations. And, you hope that we would have to push for something better, and let make that happen. And I just get worried about people who then are given absolutely no option, and the judge says, no, I think I'm using my discretion. You're not going to plead guilty to keep you in, and that's just wrong. And this bill just gives those judges too much of that discretion.
Yeah, no, definitely the judge discretion was something that was a little problematic for me, to say the least. So I think I agree with you. There's good arguments on both sides. I think NAN is leading towards starting the step towards releasing cash bail, but we definitely understand that there's good arguments on both sides. So thank you so much for being here and giving us some of the other arguments. Lori, are there questions for our friend Jim here? And British, bring British back on. She has way too many facts.
There were a couple of questions, but you all actually answered them as part of your discussion.
Oh, really? Look how good we are, Jim. We are doing the dang on thing. Okay, good. Well, yes. So this, you guys, is a very, as you can see, reasonable minds differ on Prop 25 and probably a couple of the other propositions as well. So definitely do more research. We're going to put more links up on our website. We're also going to put our friend Jim DeSimone's here information on our website too. If you have more questions or need to reach out to him for things, we're going to put British and Legal Women Voters. Their information is, I think it's already on our website. We're going to definitely keep that up there. British, you are not talking to us about Measure J, right?
Yes. On the list.
You say it is on the list?
Yeah, Measure
J. Good. Yes. And just to be true too, Black Labor Table definitely is been very helpful for this night tonight. They've helped us do research. Their information will also be on our website, and they've actually come up with a voter guide that has their thoughts and guides on that. So that's going to be on our website as well, guys. All right, British, our last one for the night. Measure J.
Last one, Measure J. This is an LA ballot measure, and I'm not going to read the full question, but what will happen is that 10% of the county's budget, at least 10% of the county's budget, would be allocated annually to address disproportionate impact of racial injustice. And so it would not be able to be used for law enforcement carceral purposes, but instead allocated towards systems that are supposed to support reducing the potential for people to become criminals. That's a shorthand of it. And so the proposal again, so at least 10% would be allocated annually, and it's called to the, it's for direct community investment and alternatives to incarceration. And so what would happen is 10% of that budget would be allocated for community-based youth development programs, job training, jobs to low-income residents, affordable housing, things of that nature from a direct community investment standpoint. And then for alternatives to incarceration, it would be allocated towards community-based restorative justice programs, pretrial, non-custody services and treatment, health services such as counseling, wellness, and things really other prevention programs. And once that 10% budget is allocated, it would be prohibited from being used for any carceral system or for law enforcement agencies. And that amount would be phased in over a 3-year period and begin in July of 2021. And it also requires the LA County Board to establish an inclusive and transparent process for the allocation of the set-aside funds. In terms of what could happen future state, it can only be repealed by a subsequent vote of the electorate on an amendment. So it will have to be presented to the ballot to the voters again. However, if there is a fiscal emergency, a 4/5 board vote can reduce the set aside in that instance. And so that's just something to keep in mind of what could change. And so arguments in favor of this point out that it would address the disproportionate impact of racial injustice because it's going to prioritize health, housing, youth development, job growth, things of that nature. And it would also shift resources from the criminal justice system to programs that are proven to address the root causes of crime. And it would also just prioritize needs, health, housing, economic investment. Arguments against this point out that it would be diverting hundreds of millions of dollars from essential services into a new set of unspecified programs when we're in the middle of a health and economic crisis. And this ballot measure itself was rushed without addressing or assessing any of the consequences. The last argument against this, well, not the last, but one of the other arguments against this points out that it will take $500 million in funding away from where it's needed the most, which is correct. So 10% is roughly $500 million. And so the last thing I'll just share about this measure is that, again, it was passed over the summer, and it's been viewed as being in response to a lot of the racial injustice that has been experienced, anyway, but over the summer, because of the racial injustice that was experienced, it was more like, this is the time is now. And so I'll stop there before I start going into commentary and turn it back over to you, Rashida.
Gotta stay away from that commentary. Thank you so much. Yeah, Measure J has been talked about, not as much contested, I don't think, but maybe I'm around all of the same people who kind of feel like this is something that is good for our community. But let's just ask Tim, who is out in the streets, who may have heard a bit more what I've heard. Tim, do you also get the sense that most people are behind Measure J, or have you kind of seen that there's pros and cons on both sides?
Well, of course, most people are behind it. The reason for Measure J is because this is what folks said that they wanted and needed. And though it may appear for all intents and purposes that it was something that done quickly, this is something that a coalition of organizations in communication with the County Board of Supervisors for 3 years have been urging them to do something and invest in the communities that are the least resourced. So it's not in a COVID-19 era. It just so happened that the timing coincided with that. What it attaches itself to is the County of LA deciding that they don't need 2 new jails, and that the current jail that they have is dilapidated and needs to be replaced. What it says is the County of LA realizes that disenfranchised communities have been overly incarcerated. What Measure J indicates is there are folks who have the political will and connection to the community that realize law enforcement is not the sole answer to public safety. That we need resources, we need training programs, we need alternatives to incarceration, we need youth programs funded. These are the things that we need, and you cast a number out there like, oh, $500 million. Yes, that's an enormous amount of money for individuals that are salary workers and may have an hourly wage by some of us. But for a county that has a $30 billion budget annually, $500 million is not that much. And for a fully funded sheriff's department who has a budget of over $3 billion, or a police department in LA that has a budget of $2 billion plus dollars, $500 million invested in community empowerment is not a lot of money. It's not enough money considering the damages that have been done to our community by the extraction of programs, by the extraction of a public safety apparatus that has grown or declined, let me say, to the extent that folks of color consider our safety a luxury. It's not something that we can take for granted. And how long are we willing to accept that? So we need a measure like Measure J. We need a yes vote so our communities can be funded, so our communities can step up and engage in the conversation and direct where that funding is most needed.
Yeah, what do you say to people who say that, we still need officers in our community? We still have a need to make sure that, our communities are kept safe.
This does not impact the number of police officers that will be on the street. This does not impact the number of sheriffs who are employed. This is money 10% of money that is coming from a general budget. It does not affect mandatory allocations to those emergency services as the police and the sheriff are considered to be.
Yeah. And also just to point out, like, this is one of the kind of defunding sort of things. I mean, it's not called defunding because defunding is a trigger word that gets people upset. But what it's actually saying is, like, some of this pot of resources is going to be spread out so that more people we can actually be able to assert different services for different things, right? So more mental health people coming out. Like, there's no reason why cops have to be the first people for mental health issues and the first people for battery issues and the first people, you know what I'm saying? There's definitely lots of other services that we can get funded if we take this 10% off the top. And I think that's why NAN is a yes on Measure J. We definitely know that we still need officers in our community, and this, like you said, does not actually affect that. We definitely will still have enough money to make sure that our communities are safe. I am going to bring in Lori. Lori, do you have anybody question about this? Or British, a question about, you know, what's going on with Measure J and the funding or the refunding of funds coming off the top?
I have a statement and a question. How do you address the fact that labor wasn't brought to the table on this measure, and it will hurt Black public sector workers who have jobs with the city and the county, who may end up being laid off based on those funds being pulled?
I disagree. I don't think that this measure would affect labor. I think it would create jobs because it would put resources in the community and allow it to engage in a degree of training for individuals that really need it, that would lead to job access. And if individuals are working, then they can pay into the tax base. So we're trying to create an environment that's empowering as opposed to one that's starved of resources, and individuals are like in so much need, they tend to make bad decisions when they're under pressure like that. So the labor question, it's a difficult one, but it's one that could be addressed with work and through time. This is something that we all have to engage in to make it work. This is not one of those measures that we want to sit by and let administrators decide how this works for us. We have to decide how this works for us. So after November 3rd, when the decision is made, when this is passed, that's when compliance and accountability must be enacted, and we have to step up and make sure that this is used in the manner that it's supposed to, and it does not hurt our people who are working.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think it is, like you said, it's difficult, and it's something that we all have to kind of work towards, because I think there is a chance that it will hurt some of the payroll, like some of the sheriffs, some of the people who work in the jails that are getting their funds out of that payroll. But I think one thing that we have to do is to, like we said, continue to fight to make sure, because 10% doesn't necessarily have to affect those payrolls. So maybe there's something that we can do to make sure that that once again, we're not at the short end of the stick, and our community members and some of them who work on that side aren't the first that are affected.
At the end
Another
of the
question. Oh, go ahead.
More jobs and more training equal less need for law enforcement. So do we really want to hire more law enforcement just because where there are more, they're going to find individuals to filter through a system that services job security, and that's not fair, especially when it commodifies communities of color and those communities that live in the margin.
Yeah,
Can I
definitely.
make one comment, Counselor?
Please.
And full transparency, I am labor.
You are labor. You are labor liaison for us.
I am a part of one of the unions that was not brought to the table, and our workers will be affected. And a lot of those workers are Black. And that it's really put a couple of unions in a very bad spot, because our workers are already asking, how is this gonna, if they move this money, what happens to me? So I think personally, I think it's a good measure, but professionally, it should have brought labor to the table so that we could have made these carve outs to protect workers that are Black and will be affected by it. Thank you.
Yeah. Great statement, Lori. Great statement. No, as we've said about a lot of these propositions, there's pros and cons on both sides. I think the big takeaway that we have from this is like voting doesn't just end in the ballot box. Having your voice heard doesn't just end in the ballot box. Actually, voting ends in the ballot box. But, we have to make sure that after we vote, we stay on our elected officials' heads to make sure that what we voted for looks like how we want it to be applied to our community. That's one of the reasons why I came to NAN, and one of the reasons I stayed at NAN, because, action very much is our middle name. Not only do we make sure that we get out to vote, but we make sure that we hold meetings with elected officials. We make sure that we hold community meetings to hear what the community has to say, to see how it's impacting us, and to see what steps we need to take in the future. And so you guys being here has allowed us to do that. It is 8:13. We are 15 minutes over, or we will be 15 minutes over when I'm done, for our meeting. And so we want to thank everyone that was involved. Thank British from League of Women Voters. I was going to say League of Black Women. She's a Black woman, but League of Women Voters. We want to thank Black Labor Table. We want to thank Reverend Tulis. We want to thank Jim D. Simone. We want to thank Tim. We want to thank Renee. You guys did not see her at all, but we have a wonderful, wonderful digital effects. I don't even know what to call her. Like, A Couture has been running this all night, and she's done a great job. So we want to give it up to her, and we want to give it up to all of you guys. Reverend Mosley for being our lead. If I left anyone out, I am really sorry. Lori for asking all of our questions. Thanks again for being here. We put a lot of work into it, so it's great to see that it actually came out. If you have more questions, please join us on Facebook. This was also shown on Facebook Live. And this recording will be up on our website. So if you know people who couldn't make it tonight, but definitely still have questions about propositions, please send them to our website. And if you are looking for an organization to become a part of, to help to have your voice heard, to help to get involved, please do consider National Action Network Los Angeles. This is the work that we do. It's in our hearts. And so, man, and no matter what, please make sure you go out to vote. I was going to show all of the voting center locations, but you can go online to find them. It is now too late to have your vote mailed, so you definitely need to go to the voter center locations to have it dropped off. But make sure people vote, because as you know, our life does exactly depend on it. So signing off, Rashida. Adios.